Newcomers to PC building may have a hard time trying to put a PC together. This video aims to help them by going step by step through how to build your own computer. Before we even begin PC, I want to show you what you're going to need for the entire time you build a PC, and then we'll move on to actually beginning to build.
The only thing that you'll actually need to build a computer is a Phillips head screwdriver. However, I also recommend that you use zip ties as well as a way to cut those zip ties, as that will help a lot with cable management. The only other thing we need to go over is grounding yourself. To ground yourself, simply touch the case a couple times throughout the build to make sure all your static buildup is discharged to the case. The first step when building a computer is to install the CPU. To install the CPU, we first need to open up the socket. To do this, we will use the small lever to the side of the socket. First, push that lever down to the side and then up. The socket cover will come up with the lever, which will open the socket up to place the CPU. From here, we want to align the CPU with the socket. There will be a small triangle on both the CPU and the socket that will tell you how they want to be aligned. These arrows will need to be matched when you install the CPU. Next, we should actually place the CPU into the socket. When handling the CPU, hold it by the sides and be sure not to touch the contacts at the bottom or the heat spreader at the top. Place the contact edge towards the socket and put those contacts on top of the socket. From here, wiggle the CPU to make sure it's fully seated, and the CPU should be flush with the socket and there should be nothing that sticks up. Once you've done that, it's time to secure the socket using the lever again. Push the cover back down so that it does not fall along with the lever. Push the lever back up so that the cover will clear the screw, and then push it down to the side and then back under where it's held. The socket should not come up or have any force with it. Now that our CPU has been installed, it's time to install the CPU cooler. There are many different ways to install a CPU cooler, so I will not be able to help you with this step. Instead, I will go over the basics of how to install a CPU cooler, and the rest you'll have to do using your CPU cooler's manual. The main thing you'll see with the CPU cooler is the installation of a backplate. You'll have to install this backplate to the back of your motherboard, and this will be what your CPU cooler mounts to. This next step is also used on every CPU cooler, and that is thermal paste. You'll have to apply thermal paste to your CPU before you install the CPU cooler. This thermal paste will interface between the CPU and the CPU cooler and will allow for better heat dissipation between them. Once you have installed the thermal paste, you can then install the CPU cooler along with its melting bracket. This next step is important to CPU cooler installation, as it can change how your thermal paste spreads across your CPU's heatsink. Once you have placed the mounting bracket, you're going to need to screw the mounting bracket down in what's called a star pattern or a cross pattern. Essentially, you're going to screw everything down little by little and in a certain pattern. Choose one of the screws to start screwing the CPU cooler down and do about 3 to 5 rotations. Then, switch to the opposite corner of that screw and do the same thing with about 3 to 5 rotations. Then, switch to the other corners of the CPU cooler with about 3 to 5 rotations. Switch to the exact opposite corner of that screw and do 3 to 5 rotations. Keep repeating this process until all of the screws bottom out and your CPU cooler has been successfully installed. If you don't do this right, you may pressure one side of the CPU cooler too much, which will cause thermal paste to incorrectly spread across your CPU's heatsink. Once all the screws have been bottomed out, it's time to put on the fan on the CPU cooler. To do this, use the clips on the side of the CPU cooler and clip one side into it and then clip the other side. Mount the fan appropriately so that the CPU fan connector will be close enough to the CPU fan header on the motherboard. Connect your CPU fan connector to the CPU fan header on the motherboard, that way your CPU fan will be able to communicate with the motherboard and receive power. I recommend hiding any of the excess slack from that connector under the CPU cooler. With the CPU cooler's heatsink mounted, the fan installed, and the connector connected to the CPU fan header, your CPU cooler has been fully installed and you can move on to the RAM. The next step to building a computer is installing the memory. Before you even begin installing the memory, you should look at what your configuration should be. To do this, look in the motherboard manual to see the recommended configurations for the amount of sticks that you have. Your recommended configuration may also be printed on the motherboard, so you can look for a diagram on the motherboard if your motherboard has it. The first step to installing the memory is to undo the clips at the ends of the RAM slots. To do this, simply push down on those clips until they've moved out of the way so that your RAM can be inserted. Once that is done, you need to find the alignment of your RAM. To do this, simply look at the notch of your memory slot and then look at the notch on your RAM stick to see how they should be aligned. Once you've found this alignment, insert the RAM into the slot with that alignment and apply pressure evenly on both sides. Keep applying pressure to the RAM stick until you hear a click. This click will tell you that the RAM has been properly inserted into the slot. The clips will also snap back up. Repeat this process for the other sticks of memory that you have. Now that everything has been installed onto the motherboard, it is time to prep the case. The first thing we're going to do is remove both of the side panels. To do this, unscrew the thumb screws from the back of the case. Once you have unscrewed the side panels, you can now remove them. Place these side panels somewhere safe. I recommend putting them in the case box if you still have it. At this point, you should be looking for the case accessories. Most manufacturers will hide them at the bottom of the case. My accessories were located in the drive cage in the power supply shroud. Place those case accessories to the side. Now you should remove any plastic coverings for the case cables. Once all of that has been done, rotate the case around and check the standoff configuration for your case. If your case does not have any standoff installed, you'll have to do it yourself. However, most cases should come in the standard ATX configuration. You'll either have to use your case manual or a printed diagram on the motherboard tray. Install all of the standoff in the correct position for your motherboard. You can do this by using the standoff and the hex adapter that comes with your case. However, my case came in the correct format, so I did not have to do this step. Once all of this has been done, you can move on to installing your motherboard. The next thing we're going to do is install the motherboard into the case. The first thing we need to do is install the I/O shield into the back of the case. The I/O shield will be in your motherboard box, so go fish that out if you need it. There will be a cutout for the I/O shield near the top of the case. Before we can secure the I/O shield in place, we need to determine the alignment. Some I/O shields will be easier than others, but there is always a way to find the alignment. If your I/O shield has a printed side, that printed side will face out so that you can see it from the outside of the case. If your I/O shield does not have a printed side, you'll have to use some of the tabs on the I/O shield to determine the alignment. These tabs will face inside of the case. Now that you have determined which side faces out, you'll have to determine which way it needs to be rotated. To do this, look at the motherboard ports on your motherboard and compare them to that of the I/O shield. Make sure that when the motherboard is placed correctly in the case that the ports will align with your I/O shield. Once this has been found out, you can now install the I/O shield into the case. Place the I/O shield at that cutout and apply force. You'll hear it snap into place, but to ensure it is actually installed, you'll have to look from the outside of the case to ensure that it is flush with the case. You know the I/O shield is installed correctly once it is fully flush with the case. Next, grab your motherboard and insert it into the case. I like to handle the motherboard by the CPU cooler, but it may be better to handle it by the edges. Align the motherboard with both the I/O shield and the standoff so that the ports can be seen from the outside of the case and the standoff can be seen through the screw holes in the motherboard. Once that is done, you can move on to screwing the motherboard into the standoff. But before you do this, you should check on the I/Os of your motherboard. You want to make sure that none of the metal tabs that we talked about before are sticking into one of the ports, as that can short out one of the ports and damage them, which means they will be unable to be used. If there are no tabs sticking into the ports, then you can just go ahead and screw in the motherboard. The amount of screw points and the amount of screws you have to use depends on the type of motherboard that you have. Typical ATX motherboards will use 9 screws, but my motherboard uses 6 instead. The screws that you use for your motherboard should be included with your case. Use those screws to screw your motherboard into each of the standoff. It may be hard to screw some of them in due to their location, but you'll have to screw them in. Like when screwing in the standoff, be sure not to over-tighten the screws, as doing too much may strip the motherboard. I recommend that once you feel resistance, you only turn it a little bit more. Once you have screwed everything in, you can move on to the next step. Since my motherboard only used 6 screws, I had some standoff left over from the normal ATX configuration. I decided to remove them as I felt that would make my build look better in the end. These are completely optional to remove since they will not touch the back of the motherboard. The only extra standoff you have to remove are any standoff that would touch the back of the motherboard and could short some components out. With the motherboard installed, it's time to connect the case connectors to our motherboard. The first thing we're going to do is route all of their appropriate connectors to where they need to go on the motherboard. We're going to route everything all at once, but first I'll show you where everything is. The USB 3.0 connector is located here on the motherboard at the top right. The front panel connectors is located here on the motherboard at the bottom right. I'm not using them, but you may, so the USB 2.0 connectors are located here at the bottom middle of the motherboard. Finally, the HD audio connector is located at the bottom left of the motherboard right here. Now that you know where all of these are, let's route each of them appropriately. The first thing I'm routing is the USB 3.0. Because it's located on the right side of the motherboard, I'll be routing it here. The next thing I'll be routing is the HD audio connectors. Since they were located on the bottom left of the motherboard, I will be routing them here. The last thing I will be routing is the front panel connectors. Because the front panel connectors are located on the bottom right of the motherboard, I will be routing them here. My case also has a USB 3.2 connector, but my motherboard does not support that connector, so I'm just going to leave it here for now. With all of our cables routed, it's time to connect them. The first one I'm going to connect is the USB 3.0. The USB 3.0 connector uses a key. There's a slight chip on both the connector and the slot that will tell you where you need to put it. Line this key up and then push the USB 3.0 header down so that it will be fully connected. Next, I'll connect the front panel. It may be harder for you to connect the front panel due to the fact that they will often use disconnected pins that you'll have to connect individually. To connect those, you're going to have to look at your motherboard manual or a diagram that's located on the motherboard. My motherboard includes an adapter that allows me to easily connect them together, so I'll be using that. Finally, HD audio. The HD audio connector has a missing pin. This missing pin will tell you where you need to connect it. Find where that missing pin is on the connectors. Then line those missing pins up so that you can properly connect it. The next thing we're going to do is connect any case fans to the motherboard. Refer to your motherboard manual to find out where all of your case fan connectors are. They should be labeled something like chassis fan or CHA_fan. Route those fan connectors to the closest point on your motherboard. From here, you're going to need to follow the key on the connector. There will be 2 slides that will correspond with this connector. These slides will need to go between the slide located on the header. Connect them to the headers. There is no specific one that you need to use, you just need to connect them to one of them. Once you have connected all of your case connectors, you can move on to the storage installation. The next part of PC building we're going to go over is the storage drives. The first type of storage drive that I'm going to show you how to install is the SSD. First, to install an SSD, you're going to have to find the mounting bracket that your SSD is going to use. Mine was located on the back side of my case. From here, unscrew the mounting bracket from your case so that you can mount your SSD to it. Once you have that, screw your SSD into the mounting bracket. It could be screwed in either through 4 screws on the back side, or it could use the 4 screws on the side of the actual SSD. Once you have your SSD screwed in, now all we have to do is reattach the mounting bracket to the case. Simply do the opposite of what you did earlier. In my case, I'll be screwing the bracket back into the case mount point. The next thing we're going to go over installing our hard drives. The first step of this process is to identify where your hard drives need to be installed inside the case. This will differ on a case-by-case basis as there are a bunch of ways that hard drives can be installed. My case uses a removable hard drive cage. Because of that, the first step of the process is to remove this cage from the case. I do this by unscrewing the cage with the 4 screws at the bottom of my case. Once you have determined where your hard drives go in the case, the next part is to determine which way your hard drives need to go in that mounting point. You can do this by aligning the screw points in the cage with the screw points in the hard drive to determine where it needs to be lined up. However, some cages may only have 2 screw points, so you can also determine it by looking at the connectors on the hard drive. These connectors will need to face the rest of the case so that they can be accessible and be plugged in. Once you have determined the alignment of the hard drive, you can now place the hard drive into the mounting mechanism and screw it in. Now that all my hard drives are in, I need to put the cage back into the case and screw it back in. Place the cage back in its proper position in the case, and then screw it in at the bottom of the case. Once the cage is properly secured and tight, you can move on to the next step, which is wiring up the drives. Now that we have installed all of our drives, it's time to connect them to the motherboard. This is done with the SATA data cable. These cables will come with your motherboard, but you may also have some extras that came with the drives. These connectors come in an L shape that will help you to determine the alignment that you put the connector in. Match this L shape with the L shape on your drive. Once you have connected the SATA cable to your drive, it's time to connect that cable to your motherboard. Consult your motherboard manual to see where these SATA connectors are. You should also check the SATA connectors themselves, as some may be faster than the others based on what they're controlled by. Once you have found where you should connect these connectors on the motherboard, go ahead and connect it into whatever slot that is. You'll know you have connected the drive when you hear an audible click from the SATA connector. This is simply the locking mechanism clicking into place. If you need to disconnect the cable, you'll have to push the metal tab on the top of the connector down and then pull it out. The next thing to install is the power supply. The first thing to do is to connect all of the connectors that you will need to the power supply. These connectors are the SATA power connectors, the PCI Express connectors, and if you have a fully modular case, then you'll also need to connect the 24 pin and the 8 pin. If you have a non-modular power supply, then you will not have to connect anything as all the connectors are already pre-installed on the power supply. Next, you need to determine which way you should install your power supply. You can install the power supply in one of 2 configurations. Either the fan will face up or the fan will face down. To determine which way you should install your power supply, look at the case. If the bottom of your case has a grill and a dust filter for your power supply to intake air from, install the power supply with the fan face down. If it does not, you'll have to install the power supply with the fan face up. With both the connectors connected and the alignment determined, you should now install your power supply. To do this, insert your power supply from the side panel and then push it to the back of the case where it will be screwed down. You will use 4 screws to screw the power supply down. Simply look at where the screw points on the power supply are and screw it in at every single one of those screw points. Once everything is screwed in, your power supply has been fully installed and it is time to wire everything. With the power supply installed, it's now time to wire cables. The first cable I'm going to show you how to wire is the SATA power cable. The SATA power cable is incredibly similar to the SATA data cable where the cables are L-shaped. Align these L shapes to ensure that the cable will go onto the drive. Once you have them aligned, push the cable into the drive. It is hard to tell when the cable has been fully connected. Just ensure that the cable is secure. The next cable we're going to route is the PCI Express power. This cable will need to be routed to the middle of the motherboard where the video card will use it. It can either be routed behind the motherboard tray, or you can just put the cable directly up so that it can plug directly into the video card. If you have a power supply shroud, there should be a cutout where you can put the PCI Express power through. Next, it's time to route the 24-pin connector. The 24-pin power connector will need to route to the top right of the motherboard. Once you have routed it there, connect it to the 24-pin connector on the motherboard. You'll know the 24-pin has been connected when you hear the slight snap of the clip locking into place. Next, you'll need to route the 8-pin EPS connector, or the 4-pin if you have an older connector. This connector will be routed to the top left of your motherboard, but it can also be in other spots depending on the motherboard. If you have a good case, there will be a cutout near the top of the case where you can route the 8-pin EPS to. Once it has been routed, connect it to the 8-pin EPS. This can be quite difficult due to the space constraints of the CPU cooler. It may also be difficult to connect if you have a 4+4-pin connector. Once you have connected everything, this is when I recommend you do cable management. This will not be an in-depth guide on cable management, but the main goal is to keep any slack away from the components so that you can maximize airflow. Once all the slack has been routed to behind the motherboard tray, you should try and get rid of as much clumps as you can in the back, that way it's easy to put on the side panel. You can do this by using the tie-down points along with some zip ties. Take the cables that have been routed, put them near the tie-down point, loop a zip tie through the tie-down point and around the cables, and then use that zip tie to tie them and tighten them to that tie-down point. From there, take some clippers to cut the excess of the zip tie, and I recommend rotating the zip tie around to hide the lock of the zip tie. With all of the connectors routed to the correct spot, it's time to do the last parts of the build. The last thing to do is to install the graphics card. The first thing we need to do is to remove the PCI Express bracket cover. You'll need to unscrew the screws that hold the bracket cover down. Once this is done, place those screws in the bracket cover to the side. Now we need to unscrew the brackets that we need. Unscrew those brackets and place the screws in the brackets to the side. Once all the brackets have been removed, we can now install the GPU. The first thing we need to do is on the PCI Express x16 slot, you're going to need to push the latch down like what we did with the RAM before. Once that has been pushed down and the latch has been unlocked, you can install the GPU fully. Line up the GPU's connector with the slot and then push it down into the connector. Apply force evenly on both sides of the GPU until the latch clicks. At this point, the GPU has been fully connected and we should screw it down. Take those screws that you used from the brackets and screw the GPU down using them. Once the GPU has been fully screwed in, we need to put the cover back on. To do this, simply place the cover back where it was and use those same screws from before to screw it back in. The last thing we need to do is to plug the graphics card in. Use the PCI Express cables that we routed before and plug them into the video card. The two possible connectors you might have is an 8-pin or a 6-pin. Your PCI Express connector should be a 6+2 pin, that way you can use it either as a 6-pin or an 8-pin. You may also need another connector, but hopefully your first connector splits off into a second one. With the video card installed, everything has been finished, and we can close the computer and then move on to the software installation. So to close the computer, simply get your side panels and place them back the way that you took them out, and then screw them back in using the thumb screws. Now that your side panels are back on, plug in your computer and then turn it on. You should see a screen similar to this. Use the screen to make sure all of your hardware matches what you purchased. Make sure your processor is the same, all your RAM is installed, and that your fans are all running. If everything looks like, shut down the system and move on to installing Windows. Now that the hardware section of our build is complete, we need to install Windows. To install Windows, we're first going to need to create a bootable Windows installation media. So to do this, go on a different PC and search for the Windows Media Creation tool. We want Windows 10, so we're going to download the Windows 10 image. Choose Download Tool Now and save it. Next, launch the tool, and the first thing you'll see is this. Accept the notice, and then it'll continue loading. The next screen that will pop up is this. Choose Create Installation Media, and then hit Next. From here, you can select the language, edition, and architecture, or you can just use the recommended options. Choose USB flash drive so that you can install it to your flash drive. Next, choose the flash drive that you're going to install it to and hit Next. From here, Windows 10 will be installed on this USB drive. I'll cut to when this is done so I can show you the next steps. Once the media creation tool is finished, a pop-up will appear that says that your USB drive is ready. Just click Finish, and then we can move on to actually using that tool to install Windows. Now that you have your Windows installation media, plug that into the computer you plan to install Windows on. From here, turn your computer on and go to the BIOS. Once in the BIOS, there will be a button that says Boot Menu, or you can press F8 to bring that up. Select the USB that the Windows installation media is on and boot into that Windows installation media. Okay, so the final part of building is to install Windows and get all of your drivers and just make sure your computer's up and running. So I'm actually installing Windows in a VM, but this should be the exact same for you. Just make sure all of your stuff is right, depending on, your language, your keyboard, and then do it. Install now, and the setup will eventually start. I'll skip to where we actually need to go through instructions. So at this point, if you have a Windows product key, you can enter it here. If you don't, you can buy one, or you can just say, I don't have a product key. Then choose whatever Windows 10 edition you want. This will have to go with your product key, so if you have a product key, make sure you choose the right edition for that. Actually, I think it may just give you that edition. You won't have to choose it. Anyways, I'm going to go with Pro. Accept license terms next. And then this is a big one. This is a big one. So you can upgrade, but you don't want to do this unless you're upgrading from Windows 7. You won't want to do this. What you should go to is Custom. Then in Custom, you'll have your drive or your multiple drives where you can create partitions and install Windows on a different partition. Now, unless you have some sort of setup that you want to do with your drives, so like you have a partition for Linux and a partition for Windows, just hit Next. Otherwise, if you do have that setup, hit New and create that partition for Windows. Now this is what's going to take the majority of the time. This is where all of your stuff is actually going to install. Windows is going to do all of its updates. Now that Windows has been installed, it's time to get the drivers that our hardware needs. When Windows installs, it's going to automatically get some drivers that will allow your system to run. However, it's good practice to install all of the drivers that your manufacturer gives. So the first drivers we're going to get are our motherboard drivers. So to find your motherboard drivers, just search your motherboard's name and then drivers. The first link should be all your drivers, but you may need to dig a little bit if you get a different link. Once you find that, select your OS. I'm using Windows 10 64-bit, so that's the OS I'll choose. From here, you should download all of the drivers so that you have maximum functionality with your motherboard. Now, they may not all be required, but I always recommend that you just get all of them. Once you have all of your motherboard drivers, you can move on to your video card drivers. For your video card drivers, just search up the manufacturer and the drivers. I'm using an NVIDIA card, so I'll use NVIDIA drivers. Now, I always prefer to do it manually, but you can also do the automatic route. But just follow all of the search steps for your card. So I have a GeForce product. It's in the RTX 20 series and it's a 2070 Super. My OS is Windows 10 64-bit, and I need a game-ready driver because I'm not using it as a studio. Search it up, and then you'll have the driver that you need. Download it, install it, and that should be your driver. The next type of drivers to go over are your CPU's drivers. So just search up the name of your CPU. In my case, I have a Core i5-4570, and then search up drivers. Then it will take you to a page with all the software and drivers for your processor. You're going to need to install anyone that says drivers and anyone that has your OS on it. So Windows 10 64-bit driver type, I'd install this driver. You can then look at the software to see if you want any of it, but it's completely optional and it's not needed. Once you've installed all the drivers that your computer needs, you are finished building it and you can move on to its normal day-to-day use. I hope this video helped you to build that computer, and I hope that your computer will be able to stay running for many years to come. Thanks for watching my video.